So that's what we're going to be doing through the remainder of Lent, and we're calling this Knowing Christ Anew, getting to know who is Christ and what did Christ teach us, especially through his parables. And this Sunday, we have the pleasure of a very famous parable about a Pharisee who just doesn't get it. And from this parable, we have this saying that comes out a lot of holier than thou, these people who look at themselves as better than everyone else and the problems that can bring. So to explain a Pharisee was a church official in Jesus' time, and these church officials were obsessed with following and enforcing the letter of the law, to the point where a lot of times they missed the spirit of the law. And so Jesus comes down to us and starts talking to the Pharisees a lot about the spirit of the law, and you find sometimes the clashing of heads there. A tax collector, who's the other person in this story, was somebody who was really disliked in ancient Israel because in that time, Israel was occupied by the Roman Empire. And what a tax collector did was they aligned themselves with the Romans. They did the job of collecting money for the Romans. They took a little bit for themselves, but they were seen as a traitor of their own people. They were profiting off of the power that was oppressing the people of Israel, really reviled people. And you know what? It was pretty awful in that moment to be doing something like that. They were seen as sellouts. So these Pharisees would look at somebody like a tax collector, as they did with many people, and they would judge those people. And they would elevate themselves at others' expense. So they would look at how lowly somebody is and just say, gosh, I am so happy I'm not like that guy. Good thing I'm better than that person. I follow all the laws. I try to enforce all the laws. Thank goodness I am better. Which is, when we're making fun of people in our general life, that's one way that we artificially elevate ourselves. Is basically what the Pharisees would do, and this specific Pharisee in the scripture was doing when they said, God, thank you for making me better than all the rest, and thank you for making me who I am and not like these other people, and yeah, I pay my tithes, and I fast, the required amount of time. I'm pretty good. In the United Methodist Church right now, it's a great time to look around and see some great Pharisaic hypocrisy. All you got to do is Google United Methodist Church. We had a really embarrassing headline this last week where there was a headline that said, I think it was, denials and accusations fly in wake of voter fraud scandal at scandal at General Conference. So there are so many church officials that we can look at and say, wow, you are the example that I needed this week for the gospel about Pharisaic hypocrisy. And there is one church official that stands out to me the most right now that I just see clear as day. They can exemplify Pharisaic hypocrisy, and that's me. And I think that's actually the way it should be. It is me. I don't see myself as the tax collector on their knees in the temple saying, God, forgive me, sinner that I am. I see myself all the time falling into the trap of separating myself from other people by looking at how righteous anger I can have in me. This passage starts with this. This is the New Revised Standard Version translation. Jesus also told this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and regarded others with contempt. And I've talked about this in a couple sermons before, but when the Gospels were written down, it was a select amount of stories that people thought were really, really important in capturing the essence of Jesus Christ and what his teachings were. And it actually doesn't get much more blunt of saying who this is intended for or what the message was intended to do than starting off a passage saying, this was to all you folks who think you're better than everybody else, which that means to me, I need to read it from that perspective. I'll give you one example of my Pharisaic hypocrisy. And I think it's fitting, since this is St. Patrick's Day, to talk about a time when I was on the island of Ireland, both in Ireland and Northern Ireland. I was chaperoning a youth trip. And on one day we were in Dublin, and then the next day we were in this town called Derry, Londonderry. And you have to say Derry and Londonderry for a very troubling reason, which is it is a vestige of the now over 400-year-long off-and-on conflict between the Catholics and Protestants there. And really, when we say Catholics versus Protestants, it really means the people who identify as Catholics are the people who really are loyal to the Irish Republic, and then the Protestants were the people who bowed to the throne of England. And that is really what this ongoing conflict, which thankfully right now is kind of at an easy point, is about. It is the British came and took over Northern Ireland about 400 years ago, and there have been people killing each other ever since and hating each other across their neighborhoods. So when you say Derry, Londonderry, Derry is what the town was named officially before the English came in. Londonderry is what it is called now officially because it is a British area. And you can't say either one of those in singular form or you're going to upset people. That's how kind of visceral this conflict still is. The name of the town is still under dispute. Funny enough, if you say legendary, the Catholics and the Protestants are both good with that. So I'm walking around in Derry, Londonderry. We have a tour set up of the town, and I noticed that a few of our troublemaking youth, and I don't mean just your normal run-of-the-mill troublemakers. I like these guys a lot, but wow, they caused some trouble on these trips. They were our senior boys, and they were walking around in this kind of vast range of apparel that said Guinness beer on it, right? And it was such a vast array of apparel that I was like, you couldn't just go into a convenience store yesterday in Dublin when we were all there. You probably had to go to the Guinness brewery to get that stuff. And at that point, I was like, oh man, am I going to tell these kids off? And I sure did. I went up to them. I told them they needed to take that apparel off, put it in their bag for the rest of the time. I don't care if it's 55 degrees outside. That was your choice to buy a Guinness sweatshirt and make that the only thing you're wearing around the walk today. Just walk around and feel cold because of the decision that you made. That was part of what I said to them. I was upset because although they were of legal drinking age, every single one of us going on the trip had signed a covenant saying, I will not partake in alcohol, which meant I, who was 26 at the time, had also signed that. And secretly, part of my anger was, I really wish I could have gone to the Guinness brewery that day. That would have been awesome. So I'm going around, I'm feeling great about this awesome lecture I just gave the guys. All of their Guinness apparel was in their bags. They had heard about situational awareness. It was going to stay in there. I was like, I really gave them a really good lecture. And we're walking around this area, and the town is being explained to us by this tour guide. And I could tell how much pride she had in welcoming people from America to this town, which had really been shut down to tourism because of all of the violence that had been happening there. And this violence has been going on for so long. Our church choir performed in a church that was on top of a hill where 4,000 people were buried from having died in a battle 400 years ago. And I walked on this tour, near the very end of it, I walked and I looked down on this area, and it was told to me that this event called Bloody Sunday had happened at the bottom of the hill in 1972. In that event, this tragedy, 28 people were shot by British police. 14 were killed. There's a big song about it. It's a pretty famous moment in history. And when you're looking down at the hill, you can see where it happened, and then you can see kind of this poorer neighborhood that surrounds the spot where the atrocity had happened. And I saw one house, and there were 6 letters on the house. It was kind of in the shape of a cross. And I'll never forget, the first 3 letters were I-R-A. And then going the other direction, I don't remember the first letter, but it was something R-Y, like you would see in a crossword puzzle. And so I pulled the tour guide aside, and I said, hey, what does that mean on that house in the distance there? And I saw this smile kind of withdraw from her face. And she said, well, the first 3 letters are Irish Republican Army, which was a paramilitary group that did a lot of pretty bad stuff in what they called the Troubles, their latest edition of this war. And then the other 3 letters were something, I can't tell you the first one, Republican Youth. And the tour guide quietly explained to me that the IRA vestiges in that town were going around to at-risk youth who had their little street gangs and recruiting them into the IRA and giving these kids the thought that, wow, I'm pretty cool because I'm part of something really big, a bigger movement. And they're taking advantage of these kids and leading them into lives of crime, violence, and hatred. And gosh, I was mad when I heard that. And I couldn't stop thinking about the fact that I was chaperoning a youth trip, and if the youth that were kind of under my care lived in Londonderry in the wrong part, these folks would be preying upon these kids. And I thought, they have peace right now. I could see in the tour guide's face how badly she wanted peace. And these people were trying to keep the hate going by preying on children. And I kept saying to myself, God, why can they not let it go? I was looking down on this area and saying over and over again, they can't let it go. Why can't these people let it go? And in an instant, I had this feeling or a voice or a lightning bolt in me that just said, well, Scott, don't you have a couple things that you need to let go right now? And I thought, dang it. I was physically looking down on an area for holding on to something that had been killing people for a very long time, and I couldn't even get over the fact that 4 teenage boys were wearing Guinness stuff on my church trip. And I felt kind of small in that moment. And I thought about the prayer that I wish I had said in that time, which is I wish I just said, God, help me to let go of the things that I need to let go of. Help me become a better person. And gosh, help these people too. They've been dealing with this for a really long time. And if there's something I can do to help, let me know. And if you can work through me, please do it. That wasn't the prayer that I said. And the reason why it wasn't the prayer that I said is it's so easy to go into the Pharisees' trap of this is a problem of they, not a problem of me. I can't change any other person in the world but myself. I can make a case, I can be kind and hope the Holy Spirit does something in them. But as soon as I start pointing out they in a problem instead of me first, then I am just as much of a hypocritical Pharisee as the person we see in the gospel today. And I want you to know, these Pharisees, they weren't awful people by any means. They had a code. They cared so much about preserving God's law. Yes, they were very misguided people, but they weren't evil. You know, there's actually a scripture where the Pharisees come to Jesus and say, Jesus, stop where you are right now. If you go to Jerusalem, Herod's going to try to kill you. And some people say, well, that was the Pharisees trying to trick Jesus or stop him. But I kind of see that as these people saw Jesus not for what he is, which is God walking among us, but they did see him as a human being and were trying to help. They were just not understanding that Jesus going to the cross was kind of part of what was going to be happening and led to something greater than they could possibly imagine. They were well-intentioned people who kept falling into this trap over and over again. Now, I'm going to give you an example of a modern-day tax collector, too, because we have plenty of those around that we like to look down on. And so I'll tell you about this guy named Henry Covington. He was a drug dealer, he was a thief, he was an adulterer, and he was an addict. And here's something from Henry's obituary. Born and raised in New York, Reverend Covington recalled in writings on his church website that he was a heroin user and by age 16 had been involved in car thefts, burglaries, and armed robberies. After spending time in prison, he dealt drugs before becoming an abuser of heroin, crack, and alcohol. In 1987, Henry joined Pilgrim Church in Brooklyn to dedicate himself to a life of service. It happened after a night when Reverend Covington asked God to keep him from being killed after robbing drug dealers. Can't you see him saying in that moment of desperation, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. Help me to keep living. Reverend Covington moved in 1992 to Detroit, where he started this church called I Am My Brother's Keeper Church in downtown Detroit, which helped provide food, clothing, and shelter to the city's homeless. And this church reading more about it, wasn't just a church that provided a shelter. This church was a shelter. People slept in the pews. People were kept warm in the middle of the winter. He lived among the poor, ministered with the poor. And he was interviewed heavily in this book that I love called Have a Little Faith. It's by a man named Mitch Albom, who wrote Tuesdays with Morrie. He's also a sports writer. And here's something more that Reverend Covington said on a night where he was worried that they weren't going to be able to pay the heat bill anymore to house all of these homeless people, despite all of the hard work he was putting in. He said, "I have broken every one of the 10 commandments. I deserve hell. The things I've done, God should be justified. God is not mocked. What you sow, you reap. That's why I tell my congregation, don't put me on a pedestal. I sermonize about wanting cherries when you're planting lemons, and I've planted many lemons in my life." And then he said, "And I may not have reaped all of that harvest." So Mitch Albom, who sees all the good works that this guy's doing, and he's telling him that Henry thinks he's going to hell, he said, "Why are you doing what you're doing then, if you think that you're going to hell no matter what?" And Henry said, "Why still serve God? What else can I do?" It's like when everyone was turning away, and Jesus asked the apostles, "Will you go too?" And Peter said, "Where can I go, Lord?" Albom wound up pleading with him, "But Henry, all of the good stuff you do here." Henry said, "No, you can't work your way into heaven. Anytime you try to justify yourself with works, you disqualify yourself with works." And you can think of the Pharisee justifying himself by fasting and justifying himself by paying his tithes. What a rebuke that is in that moment. Henry went on to say, "What I do here every day for the rest of my life is only my way of saying, Lord, regardless of what eternity holds for me, let me give something back to you. I know it don't even know scorecard, but let me make something of my life before I go. And then, Lord, I'm at your mercy." Every time I read Henry Covington's words, and I read it often, I'm filled with two things. First off, honestly, the Pharisee in me says he doesn't think that God's grace is more powerful than his sin. I'm not so sure about that. And then I get rid of the Pharisee in me and just have this moment of awe when I think, what a faith. He's kind of doing it right, isn't he? He is living out his faith in humility and love. Maybe he doesn't have everything together. I sure don't. I can be in awe of a faith like that. I wish I had a faith like that. So there's hope we see for the tax collector, but where's the hope for the Pharisee, the person who isn't seeing it the right way, the person who can't help it but is looking in the wrong direction, the person who is looking down like I was on the hill in Derry, Londonderry? Well, the very next paragraph in this book, and Mitch Albom says it kind of perfectly. He says these were his thoughts when driving home after hearing what Henry Covington had said. He said, I used to think I knew everything. I was a smart person who got things done. And because of that, the higher I climbed, the more I could look down and scoff at what seemed to be silly or stupid, even religion." That sounds a lot like your Pharisee in the story. But he continued, he said, "But I realized something as I drove home that night, that I am neither better nor smarter, but just luckier." And he said, "I should have been ashamed of thinking I knew everything, because you can know the whole world and still feel lost. So many people are in pain. No matter how smart or accomplished, they cry, they yearn, they hurt. But instead of looking down on things, they look up, which is where I should have been looking all along." Can't you hear this Pharisee saying in that moment, "God, have mercy on me, a sinner"? The hope for the Pharisee is the same hope that we have for the tax collector. It's God's transforming grace. It's the same hope that we have for us. Henry Covington's life was turned around in a moment of desperation. Mitch Albom's life was turned around just by witnessing the power of God's transformation in another person. Following Christ is not about being flawless, and it's not about looking down on other people or even on ourselves when we recognize those flaws. It's about looking up and asking for God's help, which is something that we all really desperately need. We look up to God, who sees our limitations, our sins, our hopelessness, our fears, and responds every moment by sending us abounding love and grace. So to the tax collector, to the Pharisees, and to everyone in between, all the changes we want start with us looking up and allowing ourselves to be transformed. I encourage you all to look up. Amen.